So today we're joined by Adam, a civil litigator based in Ottawa, who's really reimagining what legal practice could look like. Fun fact about Adam, he flies to meet clients across East Ontario, and he also is running his entire practice on self-hosted legal software. And I'm looking forward to learning how Adam's journey is really a demonstration of how independent thinking can really shape really unique practice. So welcome to the show, Adam.
Thank you, and thanks for having me.
So let's dive into your journey. Where did you start to like? Where did you go to law school?
It's a good first question. I went to law school at University of Ottawa in the French common law program, so my training was in French, um, which I'm supposed to, I think, say to everybody I meet. I think that's what the faculty wants me to do. Um, but I'd been at U Ottawa for a long time before that because I'd taken my all my degrees at U Ottawa um, by some happy accident. Uh, and I sort of, I sort of fell into law school out of spite, and it's worth talking about in just very briefly, I suppose. Just because I think the experience that I had with the faculty of common law at the University of Ottawa, um, may be endemic of some of the 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 ideas about exclusivity in the practice of law that pervade the profession to a certain extent, and that influence a lot of people to go and work for big law, um, which I didn't do. So I took a master's in literature before even thinking about law. I'd always been interested in law. I mean, I was reading Canada cases when I was 18 for fun, and it's always been of interest to me. And my English literature degree saw me reading a lot of really old cases from the United Kingdom, so what was England and Scotland, and Ireland. Uh, but I didn't focus on law as a topic for my degree. But I then wanted to do a doctorate in law, not an LLB or a JD. Um, and so I applied, to do a PhD in law. And I knew a lot of the people at the Faculty of Law from my long association with the university, and I was quite hopeful that I would be admitted. That didn't happen. They admitted me to a Master's of Law, which was still all right. But then one day I was pulled aside. It was just before registration for courses was opened, and I was told that I could only take black letter law courses, and that irked me, because I'd been a graduate student already, and I was very firmly of the view that I was going to be working more on a theoretical basis, rather than black letter law, which, and I guess we'll come to this later in our little chat, but um, if you can read to a certain extent, you can figure black letter law out if you've got the time, right? I think that's my foundational principle. So being told that I could only take black letter law courses in a graduate degree was kind of bizarre. And as a result of that, and this is why I say I went to law school out of spite, I just said, you know what, I'm going to take a law degree and become a lawyer, because one, graduate school wasn't going to pay me any money, to be honest. And I wasn't looking forward to not making any money for the foreseeable future. That's what I did, and I just by some luck I convinced the faculty to open registration for the JD in French common law back up, and I was admitted in September, and I applied in July of the same year, um, and so I just sort of fell into doing it, almost by accident.
And so when you start, so you started doing your doctorate. Did
Oh, I
you?
never started.
Oh, you never started.
No,
So then what?
I pivoted.
Okay, and why did you pivot?
I don't have a polite way to say it, but I mean I pivoted because I was told that I would essentially have to take an undergraduate degree in law, even though I was admitted to a graduate program. So I just
Did
said,
you
well,
want?
if you're going to make me do it, I'm just going to do it and get the benefit of it. Because
Right.
I can't apply to the Law Society to practice law, obviously, with an LLM.
After, right. Um, so then you did your undergrad, so you did your LLB, and have you stopped? I know, like, have you ever thought about going back and doing more school?
Every day. Yeah. I mean, the practice of law, especially when you're running your own business, can be a grind. Uh, we'll get to
To say
that.
the least.
Yeah.
Uh,
So, yeah, every day, I think, I would just like to have time to read a book,
cool.
period.
Um,
Forget grad school. Like, I'm setting the bar real low. Um, and then we can get into that. But yeah, every day.
so you did your articling, and um, did you start your practice immediately after
Yep.
you articled?
Yep.
And
It was very quick.
can I ask why? Like why right after articling?
That was sort of a predetermined path. I mean, I don't think it ever crossed my mind to go work at a firm. I'd worked at a firm in law school, and I enjoyed working there. Um, but I had my complaints about it. Uh, none of which I need to delve into now. But I thought, and then I worked for the government to article, right? I didn't work at a law firm. I didn't have the pressure of that environment. It was actually quite a peaceful experience. Um, and I quite enjoyed sort of the peaceful life and the more academic
Hmm.
life. And naively, I think, now looking back, I thought that I could preserve some of that in a solo practice. That did not
Uh,
happen, but
yeah.
yeah.
So if I was to ask you, so when you started your practice, um, did you have in mind what kind of practice you'd want to run? Like, did you know a niche, or were you just an all rounder?
Uh, I mean, I knew that I didn't want to deal with criminal or family. That was
Okay.
sort of from the get go. I wasn't into it. My strength was and has always been writing. I wasn't a huge fan of public speaking, um, or speaking in court, if you want to make a fine distinction. So that kind of limited me. But in terms of like positive inclination toward an area of practice, not really. I sort of jumped in with both feet to civil litigation, um, and gravitated quickly towards superior court civil litigation, just because the small claims court, it's so rarely useful to have a lawyer
Hmm.
acting for you in small claims court. I try to talk people out of hiring me when they call me about small claims court. Um, but over time, I think, like I became very well acquainted with the rules of civil procedure, spending days with it. I enjoy the variety that comes with just civil litigation. Um, I still don't enjoy public speaking, but whatever, it is what it is. Um, and that's sort of, selected out areas of practice. Like, I dabble in real estate and, acting as a solicitor for transactions. I don't really enjoy doing it, um, because I don't like paperwork. Um, so increasingly, that's not part of the practice. Um, and I've even further specialized in, I prefer property litigation, obviously, over other files. Everyone has a preference, right? And over
Hmm.
time, I acquired that preference. But initially, I don't think I had the liberty to be picky, right? Like you
Yeah.
become picky when you don't have to scramble for the cash, and I think that's something that everyone acquires after a few years.
And I think that's, I think what I've been hearing, which is really common, is that when you're first starting out, you want to get everything, and then you realize these are the files I like and these are the files I don't like. Um, can I mean, you've got such a unique journey. I mean, can you tell me a little bit more about what was your definition of success when you first started out, and has that definition changed now?
Making money. Like the initially, especially like there's no guarantee of success when you strike out on your own, obviously, and that's why a lot of people don't want to do it. And fair enough. Um, the first and foremost task was just getting clients in the door and making money. Um, I think uh, there's a lot of problems with that. I think the biggest of those problems is that clients talk a good game, but when it actually comes to them putting cash in your bank account, sometimes the wheels fall off the car, so to speak. So that I think that became increasingly a problem. You'd be doing a lot of good work, and people would just stiff you. And good
Yeah.
luck going into an assessment, especially in Ottawa at the moment. I've had just very strange experiences with assessments in Ottawa, and going like suing a client is just almost never worthwhile. I won't say never, but it's almost, especially if you're a small practitioner and you don't have someone who's going to go out and kind of get it for you. The calculus there is pretty brutal. So now the objectives and the measure of success has changed, right? And I'm a lot more selective with the clients that I take on and the files that I take on. I'm much more insistent on cash in hand, and I'm much more jealous of my time. I really don't want to be burning time on clients who might not pay. I don't want to be burning time on activities that might not,
Mhm.
bring value to the firm. And I just don't have a choice, right? Like it's
Yeah.
as you become busier and busier, right? But the key, especially for anybody looking to go into practice straight out of law school, the key is really making sure the cash hits your bank account one way or another.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a really big problem in your first year when you don't really have a client base. Um, and speaking of client bases, I mean, who would you say is your ideal client now, and what is your ideal type of files that you'd like to work on?
I mean, and we can do like, assuming that I remained a lawyer, um, my ideal client would be the client that has money and an interesting case. And the two so rarely go hand in hand in my experience, right? The people who have the most interesting files seem to be people who, are under resourced for the file. Um, that's not always the case, obviously, but um, I like a mixed bag. I really do like to help individuals, and there are people who need the help, and uh, I'd be happy to do it if security for payment was there. But I also like working with businesses who have a seemingly endless supply of funds and are able to refer interesting files for either litigation or advice. And by interesting, it's different for everybody. I like procedurally complex files. I like files where there's quite a bit of evidence to go through. My background in literature, you know, um, I think trained me to spin a yarn, and that's particularly useful in more complicated cases where there's quite a bit of evidence and law that has to be meshed. But again, right, those are the files that cost money. If the simple application, simple trial that settles out, it's not really going to be the most lucrative, but it will pay the bills. So, but that's assuming that I continue to practice law, right? Like my increasingly, and this is in part because I've had some experience dealing with the Superior Court and court clerks. Increasingly, I think there's a need for arbitrators in the province. Arbitration is a very useful way to solve disputes in a timely and relatively cost-effective manner. I think that would be where I'd like to take things. In the future, I don't necessarily want to be a practicing lawyer for much longer. It's taken its toll.
And you
So
know what? I think that's a really good segue, because I think that the challenge, very few, it's really hard to have the experience of, especially now where courts are understaffed and ever since the pandemic, everybody's stress level is so much more higher, right? Um,
I wouldn't
and
know because I started
sorry.
practicing at the tail end of the pandemic. I wouldn't know about the stress levels because I started practicing right after the pandemic kind of cleared out.
Yeah, no, I appreciate no, and I appreciate that, but I just think, I mean, I've been practicing for decades, so I know there is a markable difference,
Yeah, okay.
but I see a lot of solo lawyers just really getting burnt out and just really tired with all of the aggravation, right? And so you're not the first one to tell me that, and it's because of that. And it is unfortunate because there are some practitioners out there who get their jollies off making other lawyers miserable, you know. And one of the reasons why I'm doing the series is because I think it's really important for other solo lawyers to know that it's not just them. Because sometimes the way that these lawyers talk is, it makes you feel intimidated, it makes you feel silly, it makes you feel stupid. And I want people to know that it's not just, if that's you, if that's what you've been subject to, it's not just you, right? Um, and it's just unfortunate. That's just the reality, right? Um,
Well, I mean, depending on who you talk to, it's a reality that can and should change. Um,
yeah.
right, and that's it. I think that's something that's within the power, in a sense, of the courts and the law society. Very notionally, the law society to change. Um,
But the incentives are in the wrong places, right? Like
no, I know,
at
of
the end,
course.
like the reality is that if, and I've seen this in very recent history, where if you are able to burn another lawyer out, and if you're able to do that, that lawyer is not going to be able to work more effectively for their clients, and blah blah blah, right?
Correct. Yes.
So there is an intentional strategy, and unfortunately, um, the courts are not equipped to deal with that sort of adversarialness, right? And in some part, judges expect this adversarialness, and it's kind of like, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen type of mentality. Um, s- I just think the incentives in the wrong place. So I think for me at least, the first step is just recognizing it's not good. This is just a reality that the system doesn't have any incentives to change, right?
Well, I
Um,
think that's interesting that you say that, though, because I mean, my experience with the system is that it what I think, whether it's incentivized to change or not, the issue is always one of proof. If you were to bring something like a lawyer's misconduct in front of a judge, you'd have to roll on the lawyer and become that guy or gal who's rolling on the lawyer, and that can be very difficult for people to break ranks, even if the conduct is abhorrent, um,
you're
which it
right.
often
You're right.
is, unfortunately.
Um, but I mean, let's talk about some of the effects. I mean, um, and actually, before we get there, I do want to know more about this experience of yours, like traveling miles
Oh,
using,
sure.
like flying around. Like that sounds such a cool experience.
Yeah, it's cool if I could do it more often. I think the problem that I've experienced is that with the caseload that I have, I'm stuck in the office, just working constantly to try to make sure that A, whatever backlog exists gets cleared, and B, that a backlog does not begin to form. Um, the flying yourself into places is not the most efficient way to do it. But it is a relaxing activity for me. And it's really the only feasible method for me to cover like Eastern Ontario from Toronto East. There's no other efficient means. Like I can't drive constantly to meet with clients in Peterborough or Kawartha Lakes area, like Lindsay, Ontario. Like that it'd be way too far. But it's doable in a day, especially a summer's day. Now it's kind of difficult. It's doable to make the flight out and back in a single day. Not efficient. I don't really charge clients for the flying time. I just take that as some time off. But it does allow me to, greatly increase the catchment area that the firm serves, which is, especially in the earlier years of practice, it's been helpful. Now it's sort of less necessary. I'm much more picky because I just have so much work that I can't take on the same kinds of cases and in the same far-flung disparate areas. But with that said, of course, like I have an associate who lives and works in the sort of Peterborough, Oshawa area, so I also don't have to travel west as much. He can do that work and take those cases and meet those clients. So, but I mean, the clients love it. From what I've seen, they find it enjoyable to go to a small airport and see small planes. It's not something you do every day. And it's a really easy way to break the ice when you meet a client for the first time, right? It's a nice, easy way to do it. So it's quite enjoyable. It's quite fun. People like it. And it certainly served me well at the beginning of my practice when I did need the client base. And the easiest way to get that was to just open up to a larger pool.
And if I may ask, I mean, why not use the internet? Like, do they not have access to reliable internet services there? Is that the reason why?
How do you mean why not use the? I mean, I obviously use the internet.
No. But like when you're saying, and so to reach the clients, is there expectation that you have to meet them in person, and they don't want virtual?
Oh, interesting.
They don't want virtual meetings.
I mean, it depends on the client. The older the client, the more likely that they would like to shake a hand. I think that's been my experience. And some clients I speak with on the phone all the time. Right. I very rarely require and encourage video conferences. I just don't like the most reliable means of real-time communication with someone seems to still be the telephone. So I just default to that in my regular communications. But I think it is important to, especially when the client is an individual, to meet with them and actually have a personal interaction with them. Now, I don't, and we'll get into this probably in a few minutes, but the firm, like I don't maintain an office other than in my home, which is why there's like teddy bears and stuff floating around here, right? Like this is my home office, and so part of the reason that meeting clients where they live and at the airports close to them is useful is that the firm doesn't have an office, and I'll be damned if I'm going to pay for an office, to be frank. So like the only time I would ever pay for an office is if I could guarantee that other lawyers would rent space for me, and then I would go out and buy a commercial condominium retail space, and that would be useful for me. But otherwise, I'm not paying for it. So and I get much more positive results when I've met the client. There's less second guessing. There's less allegations that I'm not doing my job, even though my invoicing practices are extremely scrupulous. If they haven't met you in person, there's just a lot less propensity to trust. It's a lot easier to get knocked off the horse.
And I think you raise a good point, because like, so for me, in my experience, a lot of my clients like the virtual web conferences, like most of my clients, they would book calls with me online and whatnot, right? But even with me, I think the value of an in-person meeting just really increases the level of trust people have in you when they see you face to face, when they see you in the environment, right? So I don't necessarily disagree with it was just an interesting idea, this idea that um, and do clients just find you online? Like, how do clients usually find you? Is it through referrals?
Well, we'll get to that, but before we move on, I you know, I think the other thing is that if you want to build trust with someone, um, displacing yourself to their location, especially when it
Mhm.
requires a fairly lengthy flight. My plane is extremely not fast. Um, it's so slow. Uh, like I love it, but it's slow. And it will. I will need to upgrade it. But uh, making that effort and making that trip, especially in a very unique way, builds a fair amount of goodwill off the bat, which is not a bad thing to be doing.
Mhm.
Um, in terms of how do I get clients, there's quite a few referrals now. Uh, I've still faithfully used the Law Society referral service, which is a great way to start getting clients. Not necessarily quality clients, mind you. That it's pretty hit or miss, but um, because I have such a large catchment, it's fairly easy to get quality referrals from the Law Society referral service. Oddly
Yeah,
enough,
and especially, and again, because you're serving such a wide base, and because um, a lot of these areas are underserved with legal services, the fact that you're
yes,
meeting them where they are, and I think that's, I think one thing that I'm taking away from this conversation is that is really reinforcing something that I've always believed. You have to meet clients where they are. So if a client is not good with telephone or internet, you meet them in person. If they have a different way of communicating, um, like if they're more blue collar, then talk to them in their own language, or talk to them in a way that they understand more comprehensively. Um,
yes.
but I wanted to, I mean, this idea of the technology setup that you have, and you run a home office. I mean, you've really been practicing in the post-pandemic period, so you've always known sort of the digital office. I mean, how did you go about choosing Linux and choosing that as the foundation for your practice?
I mean, I was a good part of that choice was that I used Linux before entering the practice of law, so I had some familiarity with it. I'd always been sort of interested in that, uh, and it's becoming like back when I started university and I first had an interest in it. It was still a kind of a clunky thing to be interested in. It wasn't quite as refined as operating systems that you had to pay for had been refined. Now it's much more refined. You get a really sleek user experience from a lot of Linux operating systems and software. Um, I think the biggest thing for me was that it was an experiment, and it remains an experiment to a certain extent. General Linux systems exist, right? Like general open source stuff exists. It works quite well. It's quite advanced in development, and it's the biggest thing is that it costs me $0. I don't pay for software, right? Like my word processor is open source. My drive, the firm's drive is open source. The email is open source. None of that costs me any money. The only thing I pay for is Cosmolex, which is regrettable. Um, so anyway, that's a whole other project. But if someone could create an open source version of Cosmolex that would work better, um, they'd be gods. But so initially it was an experiment. It helped me save a lot of money in startup costs because I didn't have overhead. I still don't for software really. I think my overhead for software, including Lexus, maybe it's $1,000 a month, maybe, and that's because I have multiple user licenses for Cosmolex. Um, and it's very easy to upgrade my services and build things in. So, for example, um, recently I picked up a file where I have to create a very large tabbed application record. It's going to have 200 plus tabs. Renumbering those tabs would be an absolute nightmare if you had to do it manually. So, but because I use an open source system, it comes with open source perks like the ability to create scripts and small programs that allow you to renumber the tabs. So I just wrote a program, it renumbers the tabs for me, and now I don't have to worry about that, and that saves a lot of time. And it's very flexible. You can really customize it for your needs. You do have to know a bit about how it works, but it creates a much more flexible way to practice at a much lower cost.
And
Just huge.
I mean, I think one of the things which, like, so for me, so like I used to be I still am a tech geek. But one of the things that I'm really, there's a book called Dan Sullivan, Who Not How, and it's really changed. I mean, I've only been reading it since maybe for a couple of months, and it's really changed and reframed how I think about building a business, because the whole premise is somebody can teach you something that's great, but if you really want to build a business, you need to hire who's to get it done, right? And your Linux, I'm in the Office 365 environment, and I used to be really big on like coding and this and that, and I just want things to get done easy from A to B really, really quickly. And for me, SharePoint and Office has been the tool for that. I can't imagine like going back into a paper-based environment where everything has to be printed out and this and that, right? Um, but on the flip side, there are some, especially traditional law firms, that love it, right? So one of the things that we have right now is uh, we've got like an AI chat assistant that if we need to get like a letter done on X, Y, and Z, we could feed it into the chat assistant and it'll actually create the email for you, right? Obviously, we wouldn't put the confidential information in, but again, the framework of it is done pretty much automatically. Um, and I think that's where, and so when we're talking about wellness and practice management, I think that, at least from where I sit, like you've got Linux, whatever technology it is, technology is going to be instrumental in making life easier for us as solo lawyers. Um,
It's the only way to compete.
yeah, absolutely. Especially solo lawyers, so you can't do it without some sort of technology. Um, but when we chatted offline, you talk we were having a bit of a discussion about work life balance. What are your thoughts on work life balance as a
Uh,
solo lawyer?
I mean, my thoughts are it's a nice idea. Um, Maybe it's a goal to which one aspires. I think it's difficult. Like it's a fairly nuanced conversation. I'm getting tired. Like it's been 3 years of practice. I've run every aspect of the business. It hasn't been particularly easy or pleasant at times. Um, I've had a lot of frustrating computer experiences. Um, uh, Court clerks are the bane of my existence at times. Opposing counsel has been unpleasant. You know, and it's all taken its toll. And I think like my wife is a strong advocate for me to go in house at a company now, which I understand. I run the business. I have an associate and another lawyer who's sort of in the wings, slowly coming on board. It's a very slow gravitational experience. But I run the firm, right? And because I'm also the server administrator and the guy who does the scripting for interesting new applications, things like AI. I use ChatGPT because it's fun, it's neat, right? But I've got a computer sitting here beside my desk that is the dedicated AI machine with graphics, and we are going to build that into a private AI that can do essentially what you discussed just now. But that takes a hell of a lot of time and effort, right? And it's a sunk cost, and it will pay dividends down the line. But certainly now it's just another thing on my plate. So it's been tough in terms of work-life balance. I mean, Linux is a hobby. It's also productive for work. Flying is a hobby. It's also productive for work. Everything sort of gravitates around it being productive for work. And I think, when we started chatting, I mentioned that I would like to read a book, just any old book, and I have a long list of books I'd like to be reading, but I just don't have the time because I'm reading cases, I'm writing, you know, um, it's not a healthy or sustainable work-life balance. Like it's just not.
Yeah, and
Um,
honestly, I there's so much in what you just said, so much that I completely agree with. I mean, it's such a slog. I remember 3 years out. Um, if you were trying to, I mean, like 3 years out from when I started, I mean, I had a couple of lawyers, I had a couple of staff, um, and yeah, it's a slog, and especially when people are relying on you to pay their bills, right? And you're getting clients, it's tough, and I think worse if you're the systems administrator, the lawyer, blah blah. It's just overwork. For me right now, I would like. I mean, my goal is to be 70% or 60 to 70% busy. That's really my ideal.
yeah, yeah,
Um, and the only way that I've been able to do that is through having staff, right? Um, and and staff and systems, right? So I'm for the past year and a half, I've become really focused on delegation and really figuring out, okay, like how do if what what are my so-called my zone of genius tasks which I want to keep, and
mhm,
every other thing I will delegate. Um,
yeah.
and and that's, I mean, I'm at a place right now where I've been experimenting with using virtual assistants, and I've been experimenting, I mean, both local and overseas. Um, and I mean, I've been pleasantly happy with the results. But I think that there's I think that I mean the core of you think the overwhelm around it, it's really hard, and there really needs to be much more open discussion around that, right?
Yes, I mean, sure. Like it's a double-edged sword. I made more money I pocketed more money when I worked completely alone, and all I had was my computer and 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 I wasn't I might have been 70% busy, but 100% of my net was in my pocket, right? And then you get busy, you get ambitious, which is a problem for me. Just unbridled ambition, but uh, and then you have to hire staff, and that presents some inherent risk just in terms of the obligations that you're taking on and the fact that you have to pay them, right? And but on top of that, there's just this element of trust, and part of my pivot toward Linux and part of my character, and it's probably not a surprise that I became interested in flying because a lot of pilots are like this, is that uh, I'm very particular about how I want things to be done. And I like to have a global view of the file I'm working on. I don't like to have, black holes of like, did this get filed? Where'd you put the filing confirmation? That kind of stuff. Um,
Yeah, and I mean that speaks to more. I mean, a lot of people think that hiring is a solution, where it's really hiring is just one part of the puzzle, right? Like, at
you've
least
got to
in my
trust them,
experience,
and they've got to earn the
it's not
trust.
it's not even trust, it's systems and workflows. And the reality is that, at least from my experience, like I am far more or less about people, but more about systems. So we would have, so for example, there's the filing thing. We have a standard operating procedure for every single thing that needs to get done, right?
See, I'd code
Uh,
that.
I know, no, no, but technology is only as good as So for me, so for example, so for me, it's not about me doing more work. So and that used so what you say, I call that used to be me, and now it's more and now it's more. Hey, VA, create a checklist for this.
Mm-hmm.
They would do the first draft. I will revise it. They'll revise it, and essentially, whenever it gets done, they look at the checklist and goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right?
Yeah.
And that way, um, and then they save that checklist into whatever the
Yes.
drive, right?
Yes. There's accountability for it as
There's
well.
accountability, and
Yeah.
so I think that going back into the work-life balance, it's really having systems. Um, and again, you delegate to either people or technology. And I am really, really big right now to delegating. So, for example, a lot of my automations now, I try and delegate to people that I hire, right? Because I don't want to be coding anymore, right? I'll give them access to X, Y, and Z, and then they can create the
Yeah.
systems, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, because my time is worth more. My time spent with my kids is worth more, right? Um, and so I know we're running over, but just a couple of questions. I mean, how do you talk? I mean, you've mentioned that you want to move into arbitration. If there were, I mean, if you were speaking to a new lawyer or a law student that just finished his articles, what advice would you give her as if they're considering to go into the solo practice?
Uh,
And if it's don't, that's okay too. Like,
no, it's not don't. It's not don't, because like there's no reason why you shouldn't do it. And for me, there was no other alternative. Like I wasn't going to go work at a firm and uh, be in the environment that I experienced in law school, even though it was perfectly pleasant. You know, there's a lack of independence that bothered me. Um, and even now, you know, like I try to run as collegial a practice as humanly possible while still maintaining, you know, a workflow. uh, you know, if you're coming straight out of articles or straight out of law school and you want to consider becoming a sole practitioner, um, I think, and this is, you know, it's the same thing I tell clients when they come and they ask me if they should litigate something. You know, it's a question about assessing your risk and being really realistic about, you know, the possibilities and the potential returns versus the outlay of resources, both financial, emotional, professional. I you know I sort of jokingly say that being a lawyer is a lifestyle, and that perhaps sort of reverts back to a much older view of how lawyers were supposed to be working. And that doesn't mean that you're on all the time. It you know, but you could be, and you do have to be careful about what you tell people and when, you know, if you give legal advice at a dinner party, right? Like there are these things that just follow you, um, and that becomes much more true when you're running your own business because it's your
I
paycheck, it's your mortgage, it's your
Yeah,
staff, like, and it takes up a lot of space in your life and in your mind. And you got to know that going in. You can't think that, oh, I'm just going to hang out my shingle and it's going to work. It's not. It's just not. It's going to take a lot of work to get there, and you're also personally responsible to your clients for what you do or don't do for them. And you see it all the time. Sole practitioners who drop the ball because they're too busy or they're hit by a health crisis or whatever, and they get sued for
I think
negligence.
that, and I think, I mean, if I was, yeah, it's that lawsuit element. It's something to be mindful of, you know. And I don't. The amount, the risk reward sometimes in this is really tough. And conversely, it's really hard to find jobs these days. You know.
It is and it isn't. You know, if the you know, we're in an industry where if you schmoozed in law school and people liked you and you looked like you had, you know, a brain you could talk yourself into a job, and I'm reasonably confident that I could talk myself into a job now after spending 3 years out on my own, right? But you got to know people, um, and you may not like the offer that you get. That's always a worry. Um, and you may
Well,
not like
but
the work
there's
conditions that
also
you wind
not.
up in.
I mean, there's no job security, right? There just isn't no.
There's not.
There's no job security. I think if there's one thing that I would be saying, if there's one thing that I'd be saying to people is that if you go, if you try running into, if you try going into into a law job, thinking it's a lifer job, it's not a lifer job, right?
No.
So for me, I like the fact that I like the fact that I have more control of my future. Right, I really do like that fact.
Yes. Agreed.
Um, and I just think that if you were to continue practicing law, I don't know if I would go find a job. Let me put it that way. You know.
Yeah.
Um, so
I think
that's really what I would
just to
say.
just to cap that, and that's part of the risk reward, right? It's and part of the calculus for me was, I know I'm going to work stupid hours, and I know that I'm going to have to sacrifice things and time to get it done for a client. But at the end of the day, would I rather do that on my terms or on the partner's terms, right? And if the answer is I'd rather do it on my terms, then you don't really have much of a choice in terms of how you're going to practice. Uh, it just is what it is, right? And you can practice in association with people. They can help you. You can help them, and there is a model to do that as a sole practitioner or a small firm. But there's a trade off. There's always a trade off. There's always a compromise, and that's fine, right? But it's just you got to go in eyes wide open. I did to a certain degree. I don't think I fully did, and I don't think you ever can. You will learn things along the way in unpleasant ways, but it is what it is. The other thing I would say to people coming in, especially out of their first year of law school, where they haven't, maybe they're relatively young and they don't really think about these things, is get health insurance for yourself, um, and get long-term disability insurance while you're at it too, in case for whatever reason something happens to you and you need it, because you never know. And it's peace of mind, but it's something that I see a lot of small business owners, just let alone lawyers for a moment, just small business owners, they don't get health insurance. Even though they can, it's quite easy to obtain, right? But they haven't got it. And it's just one more thing to think about if you stop working or if you get sick or what have you. Or if you have a burnout, right?
And I
Like if
think
I have a
that
burnout,
and for me that's the bigger thing. And for me that is the bigger thing.
burnout,
The burnout, yeah. Because
yeah,
I mean like, that's happened to me, right? And I know where over time, but I can talk. I feel I can talk to you about hours about the whole technology and the burnout piece because it's challenging. Uh, but let me bring this individual conclusion by talking about some lightning round
yeah,
questions.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
What
Okay.
would what is what book? I mean, you talk about books. I mean, do you have any books you'd recommend for solo lawyers to read?
Um, that's so difficult because it's a it's a question of what you're interested in, right? But for the purposes of the lightning round, I mean, I think uh, I wouldn't read books about how to be a lawyer. I read a book. I have it here on the shelf actually. This was back in university. I read it's very very thin book, which is helpful for lawyers, called The Slow Professor, which is now backwards on the screen, but and it's very, it's about the pace of academic life, the pace of knowledge production. But a lot of what's in there, would apply to a lawyer and a lawyer's practice. And the pace at which we generate new case law, the pace at which is reported, the amount of cases that are reported, right? Like all this stuff forces us to speed up the practice of law in a way that might be undesirable, especially if you have limited resources. And being mindful of that pace and your pace as a human and how they're different is helpful. And the other one that I'm trying to get through at the moment is the Perennial Philosophy by Aldous Huxley. Very old book, and it's about sort of the enduring characteristics of spiritual belief, not religious belief. They're distinct. It's very, I've always been interested in sort of conscience, the exercise of one's conscience divorced from religious practices. So it's an interesting book in that way, but I think it also sort of gives you a perspective on how to approach people with different beliefs, which comes back to what we discussed about meeting clients on their terms, right? And then that's really important. It's important to read stuff that makes you mindful of these things.
Cool. Yeah.
How slow was that for a lightning round?
No, it's great. I think that I mean I'd agree with you. The best things that have influenced my business and practice has got nothing to do with lawyers, right? I learn a lot from entrepreneurs. How about the the biggest myth about being a solo lawyer?
It's difficult to answer the question because I am a solo lawyer, and any myth that once existed has been rudely and brutally dispelled. But um, I perhaps the one that seems to come up quite often is this sort of myth that sole practitioners are less responsible than people in large firms. And I don't want to get my hate on here for the Gowlings of the world, but I found the exact opposite. It's a lot harder to be irresponsible as a small practitioner because if you get assessed or sued, there's a very real impact on your practice. You can't just schluck that off to an assistant to go to the assessment, right? So it's very much in my interest to be on the ball with my clients and make sure that they're happy and that they know what services they're getting, because otherwise I could, even if it's a frivolous lawsuit, it's a huge time sink. It's stress that I don't need. Whereas in a larger firm where there's an institutional culture and people to absorb that stress, who cares? So and I think that myth has come up quite a bit. I mean, there's plenty of bad apples, but I think the majority of us are just trying to do right by the clients and not run afoul of any rules or the courts or the law society, right? And we work pretty hard to make that happen.
Um, and last question: what would you tell your younger self about starting out? So I assume that you have all the information you have now. What is one thing you would tell the younger self?
Again, tough question. In a sense, I'm tempted to say nothing because the lessons had to be learned one way or another. Um, and they were learned. And learning is inefficient. So it's there's very few ways you can rationalize that process. But I think that the biggest thing and the thing that's caused me the most grief is clients who don't pay their bills. So I would have just told my younger self, don't be shy about taking what seems like a massive amount of money as a retainer, because if the client balks at that, even though you know it's going to cost that much money, don't take them as a client. That's it. You just can't do it because there will be people who don't pay you. So just make sure you get that, because especially as a small business starting out, cash flow is everything. You can't do it without getting paid, right? And my job satisfaction as a small business owner is directly related to the amount of money that I make. If
Yeah.
I'm worried about money, I'm less satisfied about the work I do. If I don't have to worry about money, I'm more satisfied and I'm happier to do the work because I know that I don't have to worry.
Yeah.
So
Adam, thank you so much. This was a great conversation, and the challenges and frankly your candidness about how challenging it can be to practice as a solo lawyer, I think it's really refreshing sometimes to hear. And I think a lot of our listeners will really empathize and really be sympathetic with some of the challenges we're going through, and um, some of the future visions that you have for your practice. So, Adam, thank you so much for sharing your time. Really appreciate it.
Not a bit. Thank you.